Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the persona. And this is something that is remarkably present in the popular culture right now. As many of you know, there is a K-pop band from Korea called BTS, and they have rediscovered a book by Murray Stein, a Jungian analyst, called Map of the Soul. And they have titled their recent album, Map of the Soul, Persona, and even some Jungian ideas have showed up in some of their videos. So we thought that we would drop down a little deeper and talk about what is the persona, why do we need it, when does it become a problem, and how can we understand this effectively?
Wow, that's it's an important part of the structure of the psyche. Just to set it in a context of the persona, the ego, the personal shadow, or personal unconscious, the collective unconscious. So we're talking about what, according to Jung, is one of the key components of our psychological structure.
Jung called them functional complexes because he noticed that these psychological structures were present in all people naturally, just as a process of development.
Yeah, and I mean, persona is definitely one of those Jungian ideas that has kind of made it into the popular lexicon. You know, I think we're all kind of used to hearing that word. And I think the popular conception of it is fairly close to what Jung meant when he used this term.
So how do we understand the popular understanding? Let's take a minute and kind of spell it out a little bit. For me, one of the images is that the persona is kind of like the cornea on our eyeball. It is a lens that lets us see out and protects us from some of the dirt and grit and so on that would otherwise harm the eye. So it's an interface between us and the external world that is protective of our inner core and yet also well adapted to the external world.
Yes, the word persona, much like your metaphor with the cornea, is an old Greek theater term, and it signified the highly dramatic masks that the ancient Greek actors would wear when they walked on stage, and they were essential in these great amphitheaters without any artificial lighting. When an actor walked onto stage, they would often need a fairly large, dramatically modeled mask so that the audience would know which character they represented. And generally, they would represent one of the gods, for instance, Dionysus. So the mask told the audience who they were. It told the audience in general what to expect. Also, the ancient Greek masks had a slight megaphone that was detailed into the mouthpiece so that the actor's voice could carry a little bit further, because in those environments, of course, there was no artificial miking. So actors had to struggle to be heard.
Right. And so it's such a rich term then when you think about it in those terms, because I think we do maybe the popular conception is that a persona it has a slightly negative cast to it, that word does, that there's something superficial about it, which of course is true. But when you really dig down into these Greek masks, Joseph, as you've just done for us, you also do really see that it plays a very important role at kind of lets people know kind of who we are and who we are in the social milieu and kind of what to expect from us. And it also, I think the megaphone part of it is it also helps us translate some of our kind of authentic self out into the world. And that's how it's functional, right? It plays this important function that it can help us kind of get our voice out there, if you will.
It's a social archetype. We need our persona. We have roles that we play in the world. We know that we have a persona that might be the good student when we're in school, and maybe the leader of the troop when we're outside with our friends. And we modify it according to the context that we're in, and that is completely appropriate and adaptive.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So in that way, that we're talking about the persona as a kind of social lubricant, that at any given moment, all of us are having an internal experience with a lot of personal associations. It's a combination of what we're seeking and our drives, a lot of feelings. And all of this internal power and tension then is brought out into the social environment. What we need, and we learn through experimentation in many environments, is that we have to adapt. We have to create behaviors that allow us to try to get some of our needs met in the social environment without being rejected or punished or ostracized. Now, people who have a very successful persona really are in touch with what they truly want and are able to facilitate getting that in the social environment without a lot of conflict. And so the persona actually facilitates survival of the individual and the flourishing of the individual because we're social animals.
So it's a compromise, really, between what we need to do to adapt, survive, and succeed in the social milieu or the collective, and who we are and what we want and our own conflicts and drives, et cetera, as individuals. So somewhere between the collective or social milieu and our own individuality, we come to a compromise.
And this often happens unconsciously. It happens because over the course of the life, we've experimented with bringing forward what we needed or what we thought, perhaps in a clumsy way or an overly blunt way. And then people frowned at us, or worse, scolded us or ostracized us. And then we take that information in and we have to figure out a way to bring ourselves forward that's more pleasing. Now, one of the things that troubles me is in a lot of self-development environments, self-actualization organizations, that there's a lot of hostility towards the persona and even an attempt to kind of destroy the persona. So, in the 60s, it was, let it all hang out in this fantasy that people could, in an unmediated way, say anything that was on their mind, extrovert any feeling that was inside them, or pursue any kind of a behavior that had occurred to them, and that would somehow be a better world or make them more successful. And that really is not so at all. I think that's a misguided fantasy.
Well, and that's an interesting point, Joseph. When you think about, I think about the. I'm going to sound like an old person here, but when I see what younger people, teenagers, people in their 20s who really kind of grown up with the internet, there is this sense of, there are no restrictions often to what someone's willing to share online, and I think. You raise a good point. The persona, as we've been saying, has a functional capacity. There are good things about it, and there are bad things about it. But I think in our culture, a little bit, it's gotten construed as persona equals inauthentic. So therefore, I just need to strip away any of this kind of nice social covering and just really say whatever's on my mind, or not have any kind of boundaries or sort of a social functional way of moving through the world. And that can have negative consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that the internet, in a way, depersonalizes social interaction, that we don't see the other person, we may not even know the other person, and it makes it easier to behave in ways that we would not behave if that person were sitting in the room with us. So partly I'm thinking about maybe worst case of things like bullying online, that it's as if, in quotes, there's not a real person out there absorbing this, reading this.
Yeah, it's almost like the internet does something to our persona, right? It kind of means we get to disregard it or something, or maybe we have a Twitter persona where we're just very truculent and belligerent.
I'm thinking we might say there are two kind of pitfalls on either side of this concept of the persona, and one is that not having enough of a persona, which in the case we were talking about means saying things that are really socially harsh or inappropriate, or the person who's just a rebel or who doesn't have any social skills and is insufficiently tuned into the collective or social milieu that he or she lives in. But on the other side of it might be the person that is over-identified with his or her persona and really believes that a certain kind of presentation is who he or she is. I kind of think of starlets a little bit, where they try to live out a certain kind of persona of let's say, the ingenue. And that person has to go out with makeup on and hair done and always be especially beguiling as he or she is in her role in a film. And then we lose contact with our own individuality.
I remember, this is probably back in the early 60s, visiting, with my grandmother, as I did frequently. And when she would get up in the morning, she would immediately put her face on, which was the way she would describe putting her makeup on. Don't come in, I'm putting my face on. and that it was just an automatic assumption that you wouldn't leave the house without your face on. And very similar to this idea of the starlet, that you couldn't possibly leave the house without this, very cultivated perception of beauty kind of wrapped around you. What could make that problematic is whether or not, the face that you have to put on or the beauty that you have to be swathed in is strangling or not. I think that when people are persona bound, that they're really strangled by all of these shoulds, what I should be doing, what I should look like, and even what I should or shouldn't think. And this is very much present here down in the South where I am, because the kind of psychological inculcation of children by evangelical Christian ideas happens very, very young. And they internalize it as an extremely strict inner figure that tells them what they should or should not even think. And that produces symptoms in people later on in life. When the persona is really strangling even the imagination, that people have often mood problems or phobias or obsessive ideas or other kinds of really plaguing vices, which is the way that the unconscious is battling against the strangling persona.
It really is a strangling, I like that word, kind of dynamic, because the center of self, the center of I and my own personhood shifts to the outside. It shifts to what should be, how I should think. And it makes us brittle and very prone to all kinds of forms of neurosis.
Well, as a Southern girl, Joseph, I just need to take issue with the insinuation that Southerners are all evangelical Christians with neurotic symptoms because we have a strangled persona. But because there's but this is something that can happen in many different ways, right? And of course we get sort of, if you will, socialized by our parents and by our culture and told that there are things that we can do and things that we can't do and things we shouldn't think, like you're saying. And at some point, it's up to the individual. The individual needs to face this task of kind of coming to terms with those cultural proscriptions. And And that would be part of the individuation task of kind of discerning, this is something I was told not to think, but now I'm having a confrontation with that should, and recognizing maybe why it was there, but also why it's been harmful to me. And so I think it's a complex process of coming to terms with that kind of stuff. But persona can also become rigidified later in life too, when we get a lot of attention, say, for a particular quality, and then we become identified with being that thing. So, for example, if we're very attractive and we get lots and lots of attention for being attractive, then we begin to really think, well, that's who I am. We don't have maybe any sense that there's something behind that. And so that there can, and of course that can happen too with being successful or being smart or being
Talented.
any number of things. Yeah, we can become identified with it. There's an image of becoming identified with one's persona in an old Twilight Zone episode where members of an extended family are gathered around a dying relative who is leaving them all money. And the dying man says, you have to wear this mask all night or you won't get my money. And so, or you have to wear the mask until midnight or something. So they all put on these masks, and that kind of accentuate their most kind of grotesque feature. And by the time the clock strikes midnight, when they take off the mask, their face has become conformed to the mask, and now they appear that way permanently now. So seems to me like that episode was kind of playing around with this idea a little bit. So the persona is that which, it's there to do a job. It's there to help us relate to the outer world. We also need to be able to disidentify from that and find a way to relate to the inner world.
Right. That when the persona is strangling, there's a way in which it's overregulating the thinking, the imagining, and the feeling. And part of true self-development is liberating that we should absolutely be able to tolerate thinking anything, imagining anything, and feeling anything. That where the persona should help us in the environment is in the realm of behaviors. But the inner life should be radically free, whether or not we verbalize it to another person.
Well, it's a good point that you're raising, because I think that distinction between feeling and behaving can be a hard one to really get clear about and put into practice. That it is really perfectly okay to feel anything that you want to feel. Some real hostility or scorn or any of that kind of thing, because it's as if it becomes conflated with, oh, I can't feel that toward my horrible old teacher, because then somehow she'll know or he'll know, and that's wrong. Sure, you can feel anything you want. And you can sit in your classroom seat and behave appropriately. Both are possible. It's a hard one to really grow into, I think, for a lot of people.
Yes.
Well, it takes, Joseph, I agree with Deb. I think that's a fantastic kind of distinction. And that is, I think, what we're really sort of going for, and often what we're helping our clients with, right, is giving affirming for them that it's really, of course, you can think these things, you can have these feelings, and then there can be this process of discerning, and what do you do with those, and what do you do with those in your personal life and in the social environment and that sort of thing. And oh shit, I just forgot what I was going to say. Hold on one second. Hold on, I'll get it. Oh, okay, I know what it is. The truth is, it takes a lot of ego strength to be able to hold all those different feelings and thoughts and then regulate which you're going to act on. So that takes ego strength.
And I'm thinking that a lot of that stuff that gets suppressed, of those feelings about, I just hate that mean old teacher that I have for math or science or something, gets relegated to shadow. Of that's wrong and it's bad and it's socially unacceptable. So retrieving that as you say, does take ego strength. But there's been a real a lesson learned many times of, don't even feel that. It's harder to dig it back out and lift it up from the shadow, so that, yes, I can feel this and I don't have to behave badly. But it is shadow work often for people who come in the consulting room and say, and I just hated it when this or that or the other happened, and I was so angry with one of my parents or some other person, of like, the feeling is being redeemed that had to be relegated to shadow for the sake of persona development.
And in the consulting room, this ability to confess or to identify even with your analyst elements that are not readily visible in the persona begins to kind of heat up the persona and allow it to become more malleable. And as the persona becomes malleable, maybe a little bit of anger can be expressed, maybe a little bit more explicit verbalization of what you need or want could be allowed to pass through the persona mask, so that the persona and the authentic ego are a little bit or much more cooperative with each other.
Yeah, that's such a good point that in the course of development, persona may result in repression of feelings or imaginings or anything else. And as an adult, in the service of developing a strong, flexible ego, we have to moderate that so that the persona gets heated up, as you say, and that there is a way that some of those things that got repressed can be expressed appropriately.
Absolutely. And when I think about couples counseling, this is actually very, very common, where we coach clients to reveal what's underneath the surface of the persona by only using I statements. When you did this, I felt that way. And, when I observed this, I behaved in this fashion. That we actually supply in a coaching style ways of languaging the inner experience that allow them to be present without being attacking or without being tactless.
Yeah, that's a great, I think, kind of amplification of what that is. Sort of finding a way through these restrictions to allow some expression of something that doesn't usually find its way out.
I think it's because when we have suppressed or repressed something in the unconscious, it becomes really big and dangerous. And we're afraid of it, that, I really, really can't express anger or disagreement or get into a conflict with someone, because that which has been repressed and relegated to shadow is scary and it's big. So these kinds of coaching techniques for something like couples counseling show us that it doesn't have to be, something gigantic. There's a way to let it through, a way to be authentic, without having it be gigantic.
Now, we can even use the persona in an analysis diagnostically. So, one of Jung's ideas is that the persona and the shadow kind of compensate for each other. So, often what we see in the persona, for instance, let's say that somebody is always very, very sweet in the persona, in the outer personality, we can very easily speculate that in the shadow, there is a great quantity of frustration or irritability or anger, because so little of it is permitted to leak out into the environment.
Yes, and conversely, that's a great example. And conversely, sometimes you see people who are very identified with that their persona is sort of darker. Say they're kind of goth and they dress all in black and they seem real tough or something. And then you would imagine that their shadow might contain kind of the opposite. There might be a kind of a sweetness and innocence in the shadow of that person.
I'm wanting to pay attention to what you just said, Lisa, and how important clothing and hairstyle and makeup is, whether it's your grandmother putting on her face or, somebody who comes stomping in big leather boots and leather jacket and chains. And, those are things that really announce and pronounce a persona. And then we might automatically wonder, what is that compensating for? If someone has to have a persona that seems really dramatic or even extreme, we can bet that the opposite is going on in the shadow.
Yes. And I'm glad you lifted up clothes because when we're working with dreams, if clothes are a pronounced part of the dream, we often wonder if the clothing in the dream relates to persona. That's sort of a maybe a place to start with clothing that appears in the dream because it's sort of what you put on to present yourself to the world.
And the absence of clothing, it's very, very common, I think, that someone says, that they were going somewhere and then all of a sudden noticed that they weren't wearing any pants
Mm-hmm.
or weren't wearing shoes or weren't wearing anything at all. And that feeling in the dream of sort of like, oh my God. And I just suddenly realized of that there's a part, what's it like to be out in the world without any pants on? That protective layer is gone often in dreams.
And sort of related to clothes a little bit, Deb, I think you said this a few minutes ago, but I think it's important to lift it up again, or one of you said it, that we have several personas, right? We might have one persona at work, we might have another persona in at the community choir that we sing in, we might have another persona with our family. So and that's appropriate and necessary. Just the same way we might have different outfits that might be appropriate in these different settings.
So if somebody, let's say, is a high-powered attorney in their work life, and they're expected to bring the intellect forward and also perhaps a tremendous amount of aggression in order to win a case on behalf of their client, when they get home and their 3-year-old daughter runs into their arms, there appropriately so needs to be a shift, and the kind of power that the attorney persona carries needs to be set aside, and a warm mom or a warm dad persona needs to come forward, which demands a kind of truncation of an aspect of the personality, that things have to be put aside in service to raising a calm, safe, gentle child.
Well, I think that's a problem oftentimes for people, that there is a professional persona or an external world persona that becomes as if the whole person, the high-powered attorney may have difficulty shedding that layer of identity when he or she comes home.
Right? There can be a lack of flexibility in the persona, or a lack of even understanding that it is just a persona and therefore can be taken on and off or adorned differently depending on what's happening in the outer world.
And it goes back to that idea of, the child that's particularly attractive or talented. We get rewarded for our talents. We get rewarded for having a high-powered or high-status position in the world. And so it's tempting to identify with that.
Yes. In fact, Jung, at one point, he wrote, persona, this little game of illusion, is often taken to be the whole meaning of life.
Or the persona is a mask that feigns individuality.
That's right. When it's really not individual, right? It really is about meeting collective expectations, but we can get fooled.
Jung also says the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. So it just underscores your point too, Lisa, about how easy it is to be seduced by a successful persona and being perceived as being successful. I think Jung also says that the hardest person to analyze is a successful man because of that exact dynamic of being identified with the persona.
Yeah, he says in volume 5 that something like it, the worst thing that can befall someone is to be successful because then you don't realize your dependence on the unconscious. And I think that it's very similar. It's in the same category. It's like then you can just stay in the realm of persona, you know. And that, so failures of different kinds, failures, disappointments, heartbreak, usually kind of crack open the persona and can sort of pierce that. And, they're devastating, those things, when they happen, but they do open us up to the inner life, and they make us realize, they break our dependence on persona, which, although that sure doesn't feel good, it can be very enriching.
Yeah, I think that ultimately it is. There's numerous stories of, gay politicians who were married to women and presenting this persona as a heterosexual husband and a father. And then some of their behavior, their homoerotic behavior, becomes discovered by the press. And they're forced to have to integrate this secret life with the public life, often at great expense and suffering to them and their family. And many of them have come back into the public arena afterwards, feeling grateful that they were now, their inner and their outer life were congruent, and the tremendous tension of the false life that they were leading has been relieved. We might even say that the unconscious orchestrates that sometimes because the tension's unbearable.
I'm just imagining for so many people, how difficult it has been to have to conform to societal expectations when it really, really goes against the grain of who a person is. Not just with sexual identity, but all kinds of societal expectations about personality and values, maybe religious values. It could be almost anything. And the then psyche will often find a way to break this open so that the person, despite being devastated, also has the opportunity to live a more authentic self.
Yeah, I think that the unconscious will only tolerate feeling strangled for so long. And then a kind of war is set forward. And whether it happens through synchronicities and or a kind of inner torture that the ego has to allow more of itself out into the room.
Yeah, and I want to challenge this where this has been going just a little bit, because I think that, there's a way that if we're not identified with persona, then we can sort of put it on when we leave the house. We can conform to social expectations. And then when we leave the party or we leave the office, we take it off. And it doesn't have to be strangling. I mean, sometimes we just have to adapt to outer expectations, but it doesn't have to impinge upon our core experience of self. I mean, persona really can be like the coat that you put on at the door and take off when you walk back in. It doesn't have to be strangling.
And that would be the ideal situation. And I very much agree with you, Lisa. As we said earlier in the podcast, that without a persona, a functioning persona, we're just constantly bruising our head as we slam against the social environment. So you're right. The skills that we have to negotiate with the world are important.
Yes. And again, and we said this before, but it's this ability to perhaps be flexible, but to not have to be defined by the persona, to be able to choose skillfully when we adopt a persona, and when we drop one or maybe choose another. And that gives a great deal of freedom.
Well, what I'm thinking about is the example that Joseph offered. Someone in public life, a politician who used to, times have changed, have to project a persona of heterosexuality and be married. Of that when a persona is foisted on or somehow a person where it is really at odds with who the person essentially is. And that then that person feels that he or she hasn't had that choice. And that's when I think the war breaks out in psyche, as Joseph said, and then it can be a more shattering experience. Whereas it should be just what you're saying, Lisa, much more flexible.
Yeah, well, and I think it depends on how identified you are with the persona, or how total is its hold on your life, right? Because if you think about it, all politicians have a well-developed persona, except for perhaps one that I'm thinking of, perhaps is lacking in a persona. But you have to have a well-cultivated persona to be a successful politician in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
And it never really represents who the person is. So do you see it as something that you have to adopt and believe that you are, or do you recognize that when the cameras go on, that's what you're projecting?
So hopefully in the course of development, that ability to differentiate from persona is critically important as a maturational process of when I go to Aunt Agatha's and I sit properly and drink tea, that is something that I know is not me in my entirety. I'm flexible enough to, behave in a certain way at my aged aunt's tea party and take it on and off. And we differentiate. I know that I'm kind of playing a role. It's socially adaptive. And that consciousness of persona seems to me the key ingredient.
Yes. Yeah, that there can be a kind of conscious quality to it. I want to just switch tracks here for a second because I was trying to think of a fairy tale that might be about persona, and this just popped into my head. I don't know how well it's going to work, but let me throw it out there and you guys can tell me what you think of it. I thought of the story, The 12 Dancing Princesses, which is a story about 12 princesses, as you might have guessed. And I guess they're sweet, lovely princesses, and they're all beautiful. But there's this problem that when they would go to bed at night and the doors were shut and locked, but every morning their shoes were found to be worn out as if they had danced all night. And no one could find out how it happened. And they needed new shoes every day. So the king said, help me find this mystery and then I'll give you whatever you want or whatever. But if you do not succeed, you'll be put to death.
Classic fairy tale construct.
Right. I guess he gets to choose one for his wife. So anyway, along comes the right guy. And for whatever reason, I forget how I think he gets some help. He gets like a cloak of invisibility or something, but he manages to follow the princesses, and they have some magical way of entering this beautiful land where they go off to this castle, and the trees are made out of gold with pearls for buds or whatever. It's just this kind of gorgeous magical place, and they dance all night. And so the young gentleman who's come along, who's figured this out, is able to reveal this to the father and prove it. And so he gets to pick one for his wife. But it's this image of these sort of dainty, sweet, pretty princesses who go away somewhere and have I've always kind of thought that there were real sexual undertones to this story, that these 12 young women, who presumably are very proper, dance so much all night that they wear out their shoes.
Well, it's a real Dionysian part of their personalities that comes out at night when they shed their proper princess personas.
That's maybe what I'm thinking. I don't know if you guys feel like that works, but that's my swing at it.
I think it works very well, and especially illustrates that the persona can be repressive. And so their wild Dionysian selves who want to just dance and let loose all night, and the night is often a symbol for the unconscious. So the shadow emerges.
And in various cultures, dancing was considered very inappropriate. And, in the 30s and 40s in the United States, they used to call it the devil's belly rub.
Yeah. I mean, these princesses, man, they're getting down.
They are getting down, and they've got to do it on the down low because they're going to get in trouble, perhaps.
That's right.
So it's another example of whether or not it's in the fairy tale world, in the mythic world, or in the dream world. People have to have some way of encountering various aspects of themselves, even if the social environment does not approve of it. And so we should pay attention to the things we even daydream about. That will often give us a way of encountering what the persona doesn't allow.
I think that is a really, really important point, Joseph. Pay attention to your daydreams. Yeah, while you're sitting in class and you're bored out of your mind, pay attention to what comes up. And pay attention, of course, to the dreams that you have at night, because they too are compensatory to an attitude that consciousness might not allow. But at night, that's when, like those 12 dancing princesses, other parts of the personality can and do appear very regularly.
And I wonder if this would be a good time, in fact, to switch to a dream.
Ha ha. Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work. But producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
So today's dream was submitted by a male dreamer who's 49 years old, and he is an engineer. And here's the dream. My wife and I are in a kitchen or someplace with wooden cabinets and soffits and wooden counters. It might not be a kitchen. There's this large wooden head standing on the counter. It's larger than a human head, elongated and stylized, like an Easter Island head, but more handsome, no huge ears, and carved in more detail. The head says things, periodically, not like a conversation. I notice that the things it's saying are very articulate, and it's charming. My wife is making something out of plastic. It's a rigid container or sheath that fits the head exactly. We try to distract the head so that it doesn't object, but he doesn't notice as we lower him gently into the plastic casing. It just keeps talking on and off. Finally, we screw the lid on top. We can still hear a muffled talking. I worry if he can breathe.
Well, the first amplification that I have to the dream is the Myth of Orpheus, because after Orpheus fails to retrieve his wife Eurydice from the underworld, because he has to turn back with his head, take a glance at her, and then she's drawn back into Hades, he then continues in his bereft life, and a group of Maenads, of Dionysic Maenads, encounter him, and in their frenzy, they rip his head off. But his head continues to sing mournful songs, and eventually becomes enshrined as an oracle.
So this disembodied head.
Yes, there's an archetype for this kind of strange phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me And it's very moving that the story of Orpheus and just this dream of the talking head that has to be basically silenced by the rigid plastic container of talk about a compensatory function or something from shadow of what do we do with that?
Or even persona.
Do you think the head represents more of a persona or more?
No, I was thinking that the need to encase it in plastic could sort of feel like
Yes,
a persona move. I wanna
yes.
just go right back to the beginning and just note that there's something immediately about wood. There's wooden cabinets and wooden soffits and wooden counters, and then there's a wooden head. So that's interesting. I'm not sure exactly what to do with when we use wooden as an adjective, we mean kind of stiff and without kind of a spark of life. But I'm not sure that that fits here.
We're circling around what is wood. And that is certainly part of it. People that we talk about as being wooden and stiff. But wood is, of course, it comes from trees. So it has a living quality to it. And we automatically get a different feeling about something that's wooden versus something that's laminated or plastic or stone.
Yes, there's something organic about it. And then, one of the great wooden heads is Pinocchio.
I was thinking that too, Joseph. Go ahead, say more.
Just that in Pinocchio, Geppetto is lonely, carves a son for himself, and that the wooden head is imbued with a living spirit by the blue fairy. But also, it's a naive spirit, and it speaks and acts without a persona, by the way. And
Yeah.
as Pinocchio tries to develop a persona, he learns how to lie, which is often the function of the persona,
Yeah,
telling
that's
our
great,
white
Joseph.
lies.
That's great.
And, if the large wooden head, says naive things or says things that the dream ego and his wife, the anima, find uncomfortable, they might want to encase it, to hush it up. Coming back to the tale of Orpheus, that the oracle of Orpheus is finally silenced by Apollo. And Apollo is the god of structure and harmony, and is really the opposite of the unpredictable Dionysus, the god of order. So, the head, this oracular head in the dreamer's mind, which is mythical and unconscious, mysterious, speaking from some other realm, shows up in the mind of an engineer, probably speaking inconvenient truths.
Although he says that the head is very articulate and that it's very charming.
Yes, but the inner wife wants to silence it.
Yes, she makes the rigid container that they lower it into.
They kind of trick it to get into the box, not unlike Osiris, by the way, getting tricked into the lead coffin. But once the wife decides that this head needs to be contained, the ego's right along for the ride. We try to distract the head so that we can kind of sneak this cage, so to speak, or this coffin around the head, and then all we hear are these muffled sounds. But what's very helpful at the end of the dream is that the dreamer is concerned about whether or not the head's going to suffocate. So even though he might want to silence the head, he doesn't want to kill it.
Just picking up on a couple strands there, Joseph. Okay, so this head is what we might consider, or at least I'm imagining, okay, that there's a numinous quality to this head. I mean, first of all, anytime in a dream where you have something that's impossible in the natural world, that's kind of a hint that you might be in numinous territory. If this dreamer were here, I would certainly want to ask him if this head had a kind of numinous feel to it. But I'm going to sort of guess that maybe it does because there's a reference to Easter Island, and those are some remarkable carvings that really evoke something very deep. And hey, it's a wooden head that's talking, so it is oracular. As you were saying, Joseph, and it makes me wonder if it isn't an image, perhaps, of the self with a capital S. And if so, it seems significant that it's wooden because it would seem to indicate that the dreamer has a a not very well developed relationship with the inner life. That there's something that has the potential to be enlivened, and it's somewhat enlivened, but perhaps that it's been a little bit neglected and it's a bit stiff.
I don't find myself wanting to grab on to the word wooden in quite the same way. I feel like in the dream, the wooden cabinets, the wooden counters, the wooden head, in a man's psyche can also represent kind of the wood shop, the place where a man can be creative. And that wood is a friendly substance that lends itself to being used and reshaped into multiple different objects. And it's an ancient substance. Carving a wooden head takes skill. And the wood shop, is kind of, I think in a man's psyche, an archetype of that place where he can do it. So I think of the wooden head as something that is within the scope of this dreamer to fashion, or his ancestors may have fashioned, that it certainly represents something. The head certainly represents consciousness. In Kabbalistic mysticism, the most sublime image of the divine is the head of the Ancient of Days, which is only seen from one side, from which all utterances of truth emerge. So to me, I think it is an image of the self. I think that the fact that it's carved out of wood suggests that there's this dance between the conscious life and the unconscious life. The unconscious provides the wood, but some form of consciousness, whether it's arcane or modern, has to supply the skill to carve it into a representation, much like the Easter Island heads. And the difficult thing is that the ego and the wife don't know how to relate to it. They don't seem to be having a conversation. The head says things periodically, but not like a conversation. It's just oracular. There's not a rapport with it. And in a sense, the head, or this voice of the unconscious, intrudes upon the ego's known life whenever it wants to. It's not really a reciprocal relationship, and that the ego and the wife have decided that they're going to try to control this.
So, if from the point of view, in a way, of the structure of the psyche, parts of the dreamer are in conflict with one another. This image, perhaps, of the self with a capital S, of an organic material that is wood, versus the plastic rigid container that they put it into to silence it. And then there is the anima, the feminine part of the dreamer, represented by the wife, and the dream ego of the man who says, yes, I'm going to participate in putting it into this container, versus something from the unconscious that does intrude. It's oracular. It's very charming. But you're right. I agree with you that it doesn't seem there's no relational dynamic here. They're separate parts that I would hope, for the dreamer's sake, can be better integrated. Wouldn't we all be really curious if there was a wooden head on our counter that started talking? Wouldn't we all want to know what it had to say?
Hey, Joseph, can you tell the story about Osiris being tricked into the lead coffin? Because that does feel really resonant here.
Osiris and Isis are a king and queen, but they're also divine beings, a god and a goddess, and they're attributed with the great civilizing forces of the Egyptian world. They teach the Egyptians how to farm and grow wheat and make wine and all manner of good things. But Osiris's brother, Set or Seth, is tremendously jealous by all these accomplishments, and during a party creates a lead coffin and tricks Osiris into jumping into the coffin to try it on for size. And the coffin is sealed off and set out to sea with the hope that Osiris would be killed and silenced, and that Set would then assume his power and kind of take over the kingdom.
Yeah, so being tricked into silence.
Now, again, when I think of what it takes to become an engineer, and my own experience having a couple of engineers in analysis with me, that the persona and the outer personality of an engineer is highly rational, and they're greatly rewarded for that. There's a tremendous amount of intellectual power and abstract mathematical thinking, and naturally a lot of kind of self-regulated dynamics in the personality. There's not a lot of room for oracular talking heads in the rational world of engineering. But here in midlife,
okay, good point.
At 49 years old, the unconscious pops up an oracular head that's both charming and articulate. And I have to say, I know I'm going to get spanked for this, but there are not a lot of engineers who have had to learn how to be charming and articulate, that they are in terms of the social sphere. They often lead very solitary careers. Maybe they're working on a team, but really their primary relationship is between their kind of intellects and the projects. And many of the engineers I've worked with have found that the social sphere is very difficult to navigate because their minds are really concerned with other things. So here is this, very socially groomed large wooden head, articulate and very charming.
so, so it would really be a compensation for the persona in a way.
Absolutely. It very well could be.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't have any of that, in the psyche. So we're going to put a big plastic sheath, or kind of a condom, I suppose, encasing the head so that it can just kind of mumble there.
And I find it very moving that we can still hear a muffled talking, and it reminds me of one of the things that in their book, Portal to the Dreams, A Portal to the Source, Whitmont and Pereira note that the dreams do not stop. The guiding self does not withdraw the supportive flow of its expression, no matter who is or is not listening.
There you go. Perfect.
So the head's just going to keep on sharing what it has to share. But there is such a sadness. I felt sad that the head was talking and perhaps can't breathe. Although if you're wood, do you need to breathe?
Yes, there's a rejection of the numinous here. Mm-hmm. It is sad.
Yes.
This is a miracle that this head can talk and converse, and thank goodness it's charming. And his wife doesn't really have a space for this kind of extraordinary events.
I would be very curious about this man's anima, the inner opposite that we all have, which is often imaged as a person of the opposite sex. So here's this man's wife as an inner figure, and that she is the one who is so repressive. She's the one that's made this plastic sheath. And I'd be very curious about the feminine qualities in this man. And it almost seems like the talking head has some of those qualities. It's very charming and it's very articulate. And those are qualities that we often associate with the feminine.
Well, I think that's really great, and that the feminine would appreciate. I'm wondering if in an active imagination that the dreamer could go into a relaxed state, replay the dream from the beginning, come back, find the head, remove the plastic sheathing, and sit down and listen for this wisdom that's rising up from the unconscious. Listen to the head of Orpheus to say things that the ego could never access by itself, and perhaps to even feel amazed by the irrational and the strange and the parts of his own soul that the engineering, rational, Apollonic mind couldn't even imagine happening.
I agree with all of that. And I'm looking at some of the context that the dreamer supplied. And he said that he's in middle age, I suppose, and he feels like there's something more nuanced going on. And that in the dream, he had the feelings of affection as well as this furtiveness and anxiety. So something is appealing here to him. And he might well be interested in doing an active imagination such as the one you suggested.
Yeah, he has a kind of, there is, as you mentioned, Lisa, a kind of sweet sadness to, screwing the lid onto the container that's going to cordon the talking head off. The other thing I want to bring up just as another shadow element is that sometimes highly intellectual men are referred to as talking heads.
Oh,
Yes. Yeah.
And on a darker element, is this a dream about the wife just having had enough of him as a talking head, saying things without having conversations or mansplaining things, and she's ready to just stuff it in a jar and, put the lid on it because she's had enough.
That's an interesting way to look at the
possibility.
Dream. Yes. And perhaps that's a good place to leave it for today.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.